Montana Territory, June 1873. The sun beat down hard on the dusty town of Red Elk. Crossing the day Willa Atwood was auctioned away from her little boy. She stood on the makeshift platform, wrists bound, the frayed hem of her calico dress brushing her ankles. Her eyes did not blink. They stayed locked on her son, Kellan, who was clutched in the arms of a trader's wife near the corral gate, screaming for her like his small lungs might tear. He was only 5. His cheeks were red from crying, his voice hoarse, but he kept yelling, "Mama! Mama, please! I will come for you," Willa whispered through gritted teeth. She strained against the rope binding her hands, but the guard behind her jerked her back. "Next up," the auctioneer called, voice dry and cold. "One healthy, unmarried woman of 23 years, strong for labor, speaks English, no known disease. Sold separate from the child." She barely heard the rest. Her heart was pounding too loud. The crowd was mostly men ranchers, fur traders, prospectors. A few women stood off to the side, eyes downcast. Willa's mouth stayed shut. She had learned long ago that begging made it worse. A man in a black coat raised his hand. $30. Another voice called, 40, 45, 50. Her eyes stayed on Kellan. Then a voice from the back rose over the bidding. Calm, steady. $65. Heads turned. A tall man stepped forward from the shadows of the saloon awning. He was lean but broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low over sunburned cheeks, a dust-coated duster hanging open over his shirt. His eyes locked with Willa's just for a second. "Sold," the auctioneer barked. To the man in the hat. Willa barely registered the rest. She was yanked down from the platform. Her feet hit the dirt, and the guard led her toward the man who had bought her. The man nodded once to the guard. "Cut her loose." The ropes came off. Willa rubbed her wrists, her voice still caught somewhere deep in her chest. The man handed over the money without looking at her. Then he turned and walked toward his horse. She followed because she had no other choice. They rode out of Red Elk Crossing by sundown. She sat behind him on his horse, her hands clenched in the worn leather of the saddle. Kellan's screams still echoed in her ears. After an hour of silence, the man finally spoke. "My name's Orin Langston," he said. "I do not believe in owning people, and I do not believe in leaving children behind." Willa blinked. "What?" "I bought you out of that mess because I saw your boy's face. I do not plan to keep you. I plan to get him back." She stared at the back of his head. "Why?" He looked over his shoulder. "Because no child should grow up thinking his mother did not try." Her voice shook. "They sold him to a trader's family. He will be gone by morning." Orin nodded. "Then we ride tonight." Willa did not trust him. She did not trust anyone. But something in her gut tightened, not in fear, but in hope. And that scared her more than anything else. They rode hard through the night, stopping only to water the horses. Orin moved quiet, efficient, and spoke only when necessary. He had a way of looking at her like he was trying to figure out what she had been through without asking. She hated that, and she hated how much she needed him. By dawn, they reached the river crossing. Orin pulled up short and pointed to a wagon trail disappearing into the cottonwoods. "That trader's wagon. They'll have stopped to rest. We catch them now or not at all." Willa's throat went dry. "You think they will give him back?" "No," Orin said, drawing his rifle from the saddle. "But I do not plan on asking." They left the horses and crept through the trees. Willa's heart was in her ears. Her knees trembled, but she kept moving. They spotted the wagon just past the bend. Kellan was curled in the back, asleep under a blanket. The trader's wife sat nearby, tending a fire. The trader himself was off to the side, sipping coffee and polishing his pistol. Orin turned to her. "Stay here." "No," Willa hissed. He is my son. He studied her for a long second, then nodded once. Stay close. Do not speak. They moved fast. Orin stepped out first, rifle raised. Hands up. The trader jumped, dropping his tin cup. The wife screamed. I do not want trouble, Orin said, voice like iron. But the boy does not belong to you. The trader reached for his pistol. Orin shot once, clean through the man's shoulder. He dropped like a sack of flour. Willa bolted for the wagon. Kellan. His eyes flew open. Mama! She grabbed him up and held him tight, rocking him against her chest. He sobbed into her neck. She did not care that her knees gave out. She just sat there in the dirt, holding him, crying into his hair. Orin stood behind her, rifle still in hand, eyes scanning the trees. Later, after the trader was patched up and sent crawling back the way he came, they rode out again. This time, Kellan was with them, squeezed tight between Willa and Orin on the saddle. As the sun rose higher, Orin finally asked, Where will you go? Willa looked at her son, then at the man who had risked everything for a stranger. I do not know, she said, but I reckon I would like to figure that out somewhere safe. Somewhere he can sleep without fear. Orin nodded. I have land. A cabin. Small but clean. Just outside of Bridger's Hollow. No one comes out there. She looked at him, then really looked. There was something steady in his eyes. Something kind. You mean that? She asked. I do. She reached for his hand. And for the first time since the world had fallen apart, Willa felt the start of something good. The trail to Bridger's Hollow climbed slow and steady through the hills, cutting between stands of pine and open flats where the wind carried the smell of sagebrush and dry grass. They rode for 2 days, pausing only to rest the horses and stretch their legs by the fire. Kellan dozed easily in the crook of Willa's arm each night. His breathing deep and even beneath the wool blanket Orin had handed her without a word. By the time the cabin came into view, a low shape tucked against the tree line with smoke curling from its stone chimney, Willa's thighs ached and her back was stiff. Still, something in her chest loosened at the sight, a structure that didn't lean, a roof that didn't sag, a place built by someone who meant to stay. Orin dismounted first and tied off his mare. There's a spring out back, he said, unlatching the gate. Cold and clean, even in August. Willa slid down with Kellan in her arms. He stirred, then blinked up at her, still unsure if any of this was real. She brushed the hair from his forehead and followed Orin to the porch. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded by thick log walls. A narrow cot stood against one side, with a blanket folded square at the foot. A stove squatted in the corner, iron-bellied and black. Shelves lined with jars held beans, cornmeal, dried strips of venison. Willa took it in quietly, her eyes landing on the carved cross above the door. You live here alone? She asked. Orin nodded. Since my brother passed. He built most of it. I added the lean-to out back for wood and tools. She set Kellan down on the cot and turned to face him. Why open your home to us? He pulled off his hat and set it on the table. Because I've seen what happens when folks look away. Willa's jaw tightened. You don't owe us anything. I know, he said. That's not why I'm doing it. She watched his face for a long moment. He didn't look away. That night, she cooked with what he had cornmeal fried with lard. A tin of peaches warmed on the stove. Kellan ate until he couldn't keep his eyes open. Orin offered his cot without hesitation, then unrolled his bedroll by the hearth. After the fire settled into coals, she sat on the edge of the cot, her fingers threading through her son's hair. He won't sleep alone, she said softly. Orin didn't lift his head. He doesn't have to. Outside, an owl called once. Wind rustled the branches. The next morning, Willa stepped out early to fetch water. The spring was just as he'd said, clear, cold, tucked beneath a clutch of rocks. She filled the bucket and paused, her reflection wavering in the water. Her cheeks had lost some of their hollowness since leaving Red Elk Crossing. Her eyes were still tired, but no longer vacant. When she returned, Orin was chopping wood out back, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His motions were practiced, efficient, but not rushed. She set the bucket down and watched him finish the split. "You plan to stay?" he asked without turning. "I don't know yet." He wiped his brow and leaned on the axe. "There's a schoolhouse 2 valleys over. One of the women teaches from her parlor. Might be something for Kellan, come autumn." Willa blinked. "That far?" "Not if I build a wagon." She tilted her head. "You'd do that?" He looked at her then, really looked. "If you want to stay, I'll make it fit." Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a declaration, just a plain truth offered like bread. That afternoon, she scrubbed linens and hung them to dry while Kellan stacked kindling by the porch. Orin repaired a loose shutter, pausing now and then to hand Kellan a nail or steady the ladder. Later, after supper, Orin sat on the porch steps and began whittling a small horse from a pine block. Kellan leaned against his knee, watching each curl fall. Willa settled beside them, folding her hands in her lap. "He hasn't smiled like that in months." Orin didn't look up. "He will again. He's built for light." She studied the side of his face, the quiet way he moved through the world. "You always this sure of things?" "No," he said, "but I know when something's worth the work." She didn't answer, just reached out, slow and steady, and rested her hand against the back of his. He didn't pull away. The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the shadows stretched long. Whatever lay ahead, Willa knew she could meet it. Not because someone had saved her, but because someone had stood beside her and said, "You're not alone." And for the first time in years, she believed it. The first rain came 2 weeks after Willa and Kellan settled into the cabin. It arrived sudden and silver, soaking the soil and pulling the scent of crushed pine from the air. Orin had just returned from checking the north fence, boots damp, shoulders sprinkled with mist. Kellan sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing shapes in the ash with a stick, and Willa was bent over the table, stitching a tear along the seam of an old shirt Orin had handed her days earlier. "You keep that pace up, I'll run out of mending," Orin said, setting his hat on the peg beside the door. Willa didn't look up. "Plenty of your linens say otherwise." He chuckled low and eased onto the bench against the wall, stretching one leg out stiffly. She noticed the way his hand rubbed his thigh, slow and careful, as if coaxing the ache from an old wound. "You favor that leg sometimes," she said. "It's nothing," he answered, but after a pause added, "Took a piece of lead near Helena, spring of '68. Some railroad men didn't like the color of my brother's skin." Willa's fingers went still against the cloth. "Your brother. Half Mandan. My mother was born on the Missouri." He leaned his head back against the wall. "Folks here don't ask questions, long as I keep to myself." She set the needle down and turned toward him. "That why you built this place out here?" "I didn't build it to hide," he said. "I built it so I'd have something that couldn't be taken." Her gaze held his. "It's good land. It's quiet. That's worth more to me than good." Kellan tugged at Orin's bootlace then, and Orin leaned down without missing a beat, lifting the boy into his lap like they'd done it 100 times before. Kellan rested his head on Orin's shoulder, fingers curled into the collar of his shirt. Willa watched them a long moment before rising to stir the beans on the stove. The rain drummed harder on the roof, steady and sure. That night, after Kellan drifted off curled under Orin's old quilt, Willa stepped out to the porch and let the rain touch her face. Orin came out a moment later, pulling the door shut behind him. "You sleep at all?" he asked. She crossed her arms. Sleep and I have an uneasy friendship. He leaned against the post beside her. Too many memories? Too many still living behind my eyes. Her voice was quiet. He didn't press. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of things better left unspoken. She turned toward him. You ever think about leaving? No, he said. I made peace with the land. It's people I don't always know what to do with. She studied his profile, the way his jaw set, not hard but deliberate. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? A man who buys a woman usually doesn't give her freedom. I didn't buy you, he said, not unkind. I bought your chance. She stepped closer. And what do you want in return? He met her eyes. Nothing you don't want to give. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from the simple, steady truth in his voice. The next morning the rain had passed. Mist hung low in the trees, and the earth smelled rich and turned. Orin hitched the mule to the cart, then handed Willa a folded slip of paper. What's this? She asked. List of supplies, he said. Store in Bridger's Hollow is expecting me, but I reckon they'll treat you fair. You're sending me alone? I trust you, he said, and Kellan can stay with me. She hesitated, then tucked the list into her apron. You sure? He nodded. We'll be here when you're back. In town, the shopkeep, a gray-bearded man with a crooked finger, eyed her but said little. She traded dried apples for flour, brought back a spool of thread, and even picked out a tin whistle for Kellan, remembering how his eyes had followed the sound of wind through the pines. When she returned, Kellan was chasing Orin through the field, both of them muddy, kneed, and laughing. She stood by the fence, watching them, something blooming slow and unfamiliar in her chest, something that might have been safety, or the start of it. That evening, after Kellan was washed and tucked in, Willa stepped into the lean to where Orin was oiling his tools. She held out the whistle. For teaching him to run again, she said. He took it gently. He makes it easy. She looked at him, the lantern casting gold across his face. I never meant to stay. I know, but I can't picture leaving now. He didn't speak, just reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers warm and rough. She leaned into his palm, eyes closed. I want to build something that lasts. So do I, he said, and in that quiet space, between the scent of pine oil and the hush of the coming night, they found the beginning of it. Summer deepened in the hills, and with it came the long, slow work of putting a life back together. Willa rose early most mornings, before the first bird called, and swept the cabin's porch with quiet purpose. She had begun carving out a rhythm one shaped not by fear or flight, but by the steady pace of planting, tending, making. Orin built a chicken coop near the edge of the clearing, and Willa bartered salt and a pair of mended boots for 2 hens and a rooster from a homesteader passing through with a wagon of goods. Kellan named them without hesitation, and they became fixtures of his world, creatures he spoke to like old friends while scattering feed in the mornings. One afternoon, as sun pressed low and the scent of warm pine clung to the air, Orin returned from a stretch of land he'd been clearing near the creek's bend. His shirt was streaked with dirt, the back of his neck darkened from the sun. Willa was kneeling by the small patch of green she'd coaxed into growing near the cabin wall, beans, mostly, and a few squash plants she'd nursed from seed. You've got a gardener's eye, Orin said, setting down the tool slung over his shoulder. She brushed her hands against her skirt. I had to learn. The land never gave anything easy where I came from. He crouched beside her, not touching, just watching the way she checked the leaves for beetles with careful fingers. You ever think about teaching? She looked over. Teaching? There's a woman in town with more pupils than seats. She's been asking if I knew anyone with patience and a good head. I told her maybe. Willa sat back on her heels. I never had proper schooling. Doesn't mean you don't know how to teach. He reached down and picked up a stray stone from the dirt. Kellan's learning his letters faster than most boys twice his age. She frowned, thoughtful. Maybe, if she'll have me. She will, he said. I already asked. That evening, Willa sat by the hearth with a borrowed primer in her lap, tracing the shapes of letters with a fingertip long after Kellan had fallen asleep. She didn't say anything when Orin set a second log on the fire and sat across from her. But she didn't close the book either. You plan to stay through winter? He asked after a while. She looked up, her fingers still on the page. That a question or a hope? Both. She let the silence stretch before answering. I don't know what I expected when you pulled me out of that town. But this feels more real than anything I've had in a long time. He nodded like he understood. It's not much, but it's honest. She closed the primer gently. It's more than I dared ask for. The fire crackled between them, shadows dancing across the walls. Orin didn't move, but his eyes didn't leave hers. You ever think about starting over? She asked, her voice low. I think we already did. She rose then, stepped across the room, and sat beside him on the wooden bench. Her shoulder touched his barely. He didn't shift away. You don't have to be alone anymore, Orin, she said. He turned toward her, his voice rougher than usual. Neither do you. That night, no words passed between them as she reached for his hand. They sat that way until the fire burned low, and the only sound left was the soft hush of Kellan's breathing from the cot. The next morning, Willa lit the stove before the sky turned pale, and Orin came in from the barn with a fresh pail of milk. He set it down, and for a moment, just watched her move. You're not going anywhere, are you? He asked. She shook her head once. Not unless you're walking beside me. His hand brushed her back, warm and steady, and in the quiet that followed, something settled not with thunder or blaze, but with the surety of hands that knew where they belonged. By late September, the first frost crept in at dawn, silvering the grass along the path to the creek. Willa stood in the doorway that morning, shawl wrapped tight, watching her breath in the air. Inside, Kellan sat at the table, tongue between his teeth as he traced his letters with a stick of charcoal, the waxed cloth beneath his page keeping the wood from smudging. Orin had gone before first light to help a neighbor drive cattle before the weather soured, taking only a biscuit and his saddlebag with him. Willa had begun walking into Bridger's Hollow twice a week, teaching the youngest children in the parlor school. She carried her lessons in a cloth pouch. Using chalk she mixed herself from ground bone and lye. The children called her Miss Atwood, and though her voice never rose above the rustle of a page, they listened. She had earned that. That afternoon, Kellan helped her gather the last squash from the garden, his breath coming in little clouds. As they knelt side by side, he asked, Will it snow soon? Not yet, she said, brushing dirt from a gourd. But the ground's telling us it's near. He nodded solemnly, like he was speaking with the earth itself. Will we stay warm? We'll be ready, she said, and he believed her. Orin returned just ahead of dusk, boots muddy, his coat damp from creek spray. He handed her a pouch of coins payment for the cattle drive and a small wrapped bundle of beeswax candles from town. I passed the general store, he said, setting them on the shelf. Figured we'd need light once the days shorten. Willa reached for his coat, hung it on the peg, and paused. You're limping more today. It's nothing, he said, but when she looked at him, he added, There's cold coming in the bone. It'll ease off once I rest. She laid a hand on his arm. Let me see to it. He hesitated, then nodded. After supper. That night, she boiled water, steeped comfrey roots, and soaked a cloth. He sat on the bench, quiet, while she worked the warm compress over his thigh. Her touch was firm but gentle, and he didn't flinch. The air between them had shifted lately, no longer tentative, no longer filled with questions needing answers. "I've been thinking," he said, "about taking your last name off that ledger in town, the one that marked you as purchased." Willa's hand stilled. "You found it?" He nodded. "Ask the clerk to show me where they keep the older records. It's a single line. We can strike it through." She looked at him, her voice steady. "I'd like that." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "We'll sign this if it's what you want. It's not a certificate like folks back east, but the minister in Hollow says it's legal enough, so long as we both write our names." Willa took the paper, opened it slowly, and read the words. It was plain, honest. A statement of marriage by agreement between two people of full age, witnessed by none but each other. She looked up. "You waited to ask." "I waited until you didn't flinch when I stood too close." Her throat tightened. "I want to be your wife, Orin Langston." He took her hand, and there was no ceremony beyond that, no preacher, no ring. Just the two of them at the table, Kellan asleep nearby, the fire low and warm. They wrote their names, hers first, his second, and folded the paper back along its crease. The next day, Orin built a small cedar box and set the paper inside, placing it on the mantel beside a faded daguerreotype of his brother. Willa added a scrap of lace from her mother's shawl. It was the only thing she'd carried from Missouri, and it had held too many memories to use until now. As October set in, the three of them gathered firewood, preserved jars of apples and beans, and patched the roof where a squirrel had chewed through the thatch. Kellan's whistle trilled in the mornings, and his laughter echoed through the trees behind the cabin. The quilt on their bed grew heavier with each passing week, and Orin's coat hung beside Willa's shawl on the peg by the door. Their lives no longer separate threads but one cloth, strong at the seams. By early November, snow dusted the ridge. Willa stood beside Orin as he hitched the mule to the sled. Kellan bundled up tight in a coat 2 sizes too big. They were headed to the schoolhouse, where the children would sing songs and hang paper chains before the winter break. She would bring cornbread, and Orin would fix the broken latch on the woodbox. As they passed the grove where the first yellow leaves had fallen weeks before, Willa reached for Orin's hand beneath the wool blanket across their laps. He looked at her, his eyes steady. "You warm enough? With you beside me?" She smiled. "Always." The sled creaked forward, the path opening wide beneath the trees, and the snow fell soft and slow like a blessing. Their home waited behind them, and the road ahead was theirs to shape, not promised, but chosen. They kept choosing each day after that. Through storms and thaw, laughter and quiet, through the slow, beautiful work of building a life together, one that would hold.